Well, so yeah, my name is Diego Rubio. I'm the executive director of the Center for the Governance of Change, and since I'm one of the organizers of this event, I have saved for myself the privilege of chairing this panel. It's a wonderful panel that is going to try to address a very complicated questions regarding the challenges and opportunities that new technologies bring for governments and public institutions nowadays. Now, to address this, we have a wonderful set of speakers that combine the expertise of academia with the experience of practitioners. To my left, I have Professor Helen Margetts, who is the director of the Oxford Internet Institute, one of the most influential institutions studying digital age and politics and policy based at the University of Oxford. Helen is a world-leading scholar and a political scientist. She has published more than 100 books and articles dealing with, digital media, communication, and policy, internet, and these things. And she has worked and advised a number of institutions, including the UK government. Thank you very much for being here, Helen. We have also Pere Vallès, who is the executive director of Untitled, which is, he won't like me saying this, but it is true, is the company that is transforming the online voting industry in the world. So it's a Spanish company, and in the past 10 years, they've developed some of the most advanced softwares for online voting. They have managed over 100,000 electoral processes all over the world, and they've worked with 42 different countries, including Switzerland, the United States, Canada, India, you name it. We have Dr. Tanya, who is the head of the GovTech initiative in Cambridge University's Institute for Public Policy. She's an expert on policy engagement and digital state with a special focus on the Anglo-Saxon world and Latin America. She's also a member of the Council of the Future of Information of the World Economic Forum and many other institutions. Thank you very much, Tanya, for being here. And last but not least, we have Dr. Ozren Jungic, who works as policy analyst at the Canadian government and is part of its Policy Leaders program. He's also an external contributor for the Economist Intelligence Unit, an IE Future World Fellow, and a fellow at the Graham Institute of the University of Toronto. Ozren is interested in new technology solutions to govern, applies to governance issues. He mixes his experience as academic and as a practitioner, and he has asked me several times to remind you that he will be expressing his views only and not the views of the Canadian government. Well, thank you very much all for being here. Now let me explain you briefly the main idea of this panel, because what we've seen, I think that our states are facing a crucial dilemma in the way they relate with technologies. 10 years ago, there was a huge optimism about how new technologies will help us to enhance democracy, to increase citizens' participation, design better policies, fight corruption, everything. And according to that, many governments invested billions in integrating these new technologies such as blockchain or AI or big data into their administrative and policy making processes. Now, that situation has changed significantly in the last 2 years. Because all these controversies and scandals that we've seen related to, Russian bots, social networks, fake news, Russian institutions trying to hack public institutions in the West, all these things have made us a little bit feared of these technologies, and actually we've gone from optimism to some kind of rejection in certain places, or at least doubts. my main question for you, the first question for you is, what is your interpretation of this process? How do you see what do you think are the main drivers, and how do you see this evolving in the coming years? And related to that, what's your position on the main topic of the panel? Do you think that new technologies are about to save democracy and our welfare states, or they're gonna produce their collapse? Thank you very much. Helen?
Well, I think, first of all, it is important to retain some of the optimism of the early years, just some of it, because the relationship between technology and democracy has had a big knock in the past weeks and months with all the phenomena that you describe. But we should remember that some exciting things have happened over the last 7, 8, 9 years in terms of just the fact that political participation has become accessible to a lot more people, in terms of people being able to undertake kind of tiny acts of political participation that just weren't possible before. There's no pre-social media equivalent to liking something or sharing something, a piece of political news, and people do that more than they read it. People share things they don't read. That's a little act of political participation. It's very small, but then the costs are very small. And those little acts can scale up to things really big. New political and social movements, drawing new people into politics. Young people, for example, look at the movement to introduce gun control in the US among school children in the wake of the recent shooting in the US. So that is still exciting. Having said that, there's no doubt that technology puts new pressures on governments. Pressures that in some cases have been accumulating over years and some that are really new. And I'd say there's 3 types of pressures that government is facing to make the most of technology. One comes from the technology itself, and that's a pressure to innovate. Governments, some governments, the US government, the UK government, for example, used to be leaders in technology back in the 50s and 60s. They were sort of leading the way and the private sector was following. But over time, a lot of governments have struggled with big tech projects. They've struggled with contracting, with public-private partnerships and government contracts. They've just struggled to make the most of them and to make the kind of efficiency savings and get the benefits of technology. So that's one pressure. Another pressure comes from digital society. The internet and technologies related to the internet are the first technologies where citizens have had the capacity to innovate. Earlier technologies, you know, large-scale computer systems really didn't make... They automated processes, but they didn't offer citizens much possibility to actually kind of generate innovation. And that's something which government finds difficult, where it's always on the hop. That's in terms of good things, on all the kind of movements that are putting pressure on governments to change policy or change direction, even change regime. And also in terms of actually policing society, there's new sorts of crime, there's new sorts of ways to do harm. Look at the rise of online hate speech, for example. How can governments tackle things which are illegal but are very difficult to police? What about policing? What about when the police turn up at a drugs den, for example? Used to be some way of finding out what's going on and finding the trail of crime. Now it's more likely to be a couple of encrypted mobiles, you know, not an easy thing to police at all. And finally, there's the question of the digital economy. How does government regulate the digital economy? What about the taxi industry being transformed by Uber and Lyft and platforms like that? How does government do the traditional business of government, like protecting workers' rights and protecting prices and protecting consumers? Basically, those are data-intensive digital platforms based on opaque algorithms, which are very, very difficult for government to intervene in. So that's another pressure, actually dealing with the digital economy. So those are my 1 note of hope and 3 notes of caution or things to do.
Thank you very much. Pere.
Sure. I'm with a company that is trying to transform one of the most critical functions of government, which is running elections, and it's difficult. And we all, I think we all, in general, as a society, we all complain always that the governments, they're very risk-averse, they are not very innovative, they're very conservative when it comes to change, but the reality is that in part it's because of us. And in part it's what I would describe as a rational behavior. You know, when a government, mentioning one of Helen's pressures, tries to do a big IT project and everything goes perfect, they're very, very lucky if they get a couple of lines, you know, on page 55 of a local newspaper. But on the other hand, if the project goes wrong, and it doesn't have to be a complete fiasco, if something goes not perfectly according to plan, then it makes the big news, you know, and it's on the front of the newspapers, and it makes the national news. So the risk-reward equation that we currently have and the governments currently face is not well balanced, and I think that if we want governments to be more innovative and to take more risks, we need to not install the same culture that exists with the startups, you know, which is a culture of tolerance for failure, and where failure is almost rewarded, you know, because if you fail in something, it means that you have learned, and the next time that you do it, you're not going to fail, and you're going to make the same mistakes. I don't think that's the culture that we want with governments, but at least we need to be a little bit more tolerant, you know, for failure if we want governments to really innovate and to really change things. In terms of the trends that affect the part of the government where I'm in, and I noticed that I'm the only panelist that doesn't have a doctorate, so I need to focus a lot on what I know.
There are certain universities here where you can get one quite easily.
I know.
We can
I'm applying.
Don't worry.
But so in terms of the trend that I see in our space, in what you could call the e-democracy space, I think the trend is very clear. I mean, towards more open and inclusive governments, more participation. I think people, citizens are demanding that. Political parties have that at least on their political agendas. Then another thing is to implement it, you know. But the reality is that, and it's a reality that we all know and we're all aware because we watch the news, is that in the last few months there's been some news that's clearly going against this, you know, that creates some bumps in this road that leads to this open and transparent government that facilitates participation. Honestly, my opinion is that it's not as bad as it looks, you know, or as it seems. I think we were discussing it before over lunch that there's always been influence in elections. So this is not something that is happening for the first time in the 21st century. It has happened before. Before, the difference was that a few families or a few people owned the newspapers and TV stations and radio stations, and they were the ones who could manipulate or who could basically push their political agenda. And now everybody who has a mobile phone and access to the internet can basically fabricate a piece of news, you know, and push it to all his friends, you know. So, to some degree, provocatively, what I say is that we have democratized, you know, fake news. You know, we have allowed everybody to fabricate their own news. So this is not new. This has happened. Now we all of a sudden seem to have discovered that Facebook is a company that wants to make money, and the way they make money is because they get access to our information and they monetize, you know, this information. But I think it was obvious, you know, that this was happening. And then the other thing that has happened is that there's been, and obviously I represent a company that is involved in elections in 42 countries, and I have to look and be politically neutral. But I think there's been big parts of society that haven't liked the outcomes of two particular election events, you know, the referendum in Britain and the election in the US. And they've looked for the cause, and the cause is the fake news and the manipulation of the people. I don't know. I think the reality is more complex than that. I think what is the option? Going back to basically an enlightened despotism like we had in the 18th century, you know, where we have a big brother or a government that is the one who controls what can be published, what cannot be published, or do we treat citizens as adults and basically assume that they can sort out what is fake and what is not fake and put more faith, you know, on the people? But again, I think the big trend, which is towards more participation, more democracy, more digitalization of government, is there and is going to be there. There are going to be some bumps on the road. I'm not saying that nothing needs to be done. I think there are a lot of things that can be fixed and that can be improved. But I think what we're seeing right now is not going to change basically the way governments are going to work in the future.
That's great. Thank you, Pere. Tanya.
Thank you, Diego. It's great to be here and to learn about the Spanish GovTech ecosystem. I want to answer your question by thinking a little bit about the role of GovTech in the future of democracy, because I think that we're at a really pivotal moment in the emergence of GovTech as a sector in Europe. And just to give an example, in the UK, our government recently announced the launch of a 20 million GovTech catalyst scheme and fund. So it's really something that is rising to prominence within government and among policymakers, as well as within the private sector, where we're seeing, for example, the emergence of a VC fund in London, which is focused specifically on GovTech. So GovTech is obviously still quite a young sector, and it hasn't quite settled upon a definition. There are various versions. Some of them focus specifically on public sector service provision, and others focus more generally on the pain points of government. But what they tend to have in common is a focus on delivering efficiency and on helping to improve public sector productivity, which is a big problem, not least in the UK. What I think is really interesting to think about, though, is whether GovTech can actually play an important role in helping democracy as well, because efficiency and productivity are not necessarily natural bedfellows with democracy. So how do we balance those two things? And I think it's a really interesting moment to be asking that question, because we're kind of experiencing a sort of double crisis of confidence. On the one hand, on institutes, including institutions of governance, and that's been brewing for several years. And of course, more recently also, we're seeing what some people are calling the dawn of a techlash. I mean, it remains to be seen whether that develops, but it's certainly something that we're beginning to see. So GovTech, of course, emerges at the confluence of these two crises, the institutions of governance and the tech backlash. So I think that provides the sector with an opportunity, actually. If it can be trustworthy, if it can appreciate things like a right to privacy, if it can be accountable, then it has the possibility of rehabilitating people's faith in institutions. And I think if it doesn't manage to put democracy at its core, there's a very real risk that it will push people further towards anti-system options. So I think there are two possible futures, and I think it's the responsibility of many different stakeholders to play a role in shaping the sector. And I think we're at an early enough point for that to be a really valuable thing to do. So, for example, I think investors and founders need to think about how they choose clients. So we talk about the GovTech, the global GovTech market as being a £1 trillion sector. But what does a global GovTech sector mean? It means working with many governments that are non-democracies or weak democracies. So how are founders with global aspirations going to go about picking their clients? Just for one example. I think there are many other stakeholders that have a role to play, policymakers, of course, regarding regulation, academics in working out what is and isn't working for society and communicating that. But I think we're at a really interesting moment, and if we can make sure that we shape the GovTech sector in useful ways now, then there's a very real chance that it can help to strengthen democracy going forward.
Great, thank you very much. Ozren.
Thanks, Diego. I think my colleagues here have covered a lot of ground. I kind of wish I hadn't gone fourth. I'd like to get back to, Diego, your initial point about how, let's say 10 years ago or 15 years ago, there was a great optimism, and let's say with the events of the last few months or last year, we've kind of become a lot more skeptical about new technologies. I feel like, you know, we're now experiencing the growing pains of a very rapid adoption of new technologies. And now we're seeing that there are downsides to the use of this technology. And by the way, I mean something as simple as social media and like Twitter, for example. We can see something that we saw as an inherent good being used in a way that we're not so comfortable with. And I think the lesson from that is that, you know, a lot of these new technologies, including, you know, some of these startup ideas that we heard about today, they're not inherently good or bad. They're tools. They're tools for us to use, and what I think, you know, for example, this Facebook data breach has prompted for the first time is a very serious global discussion about how to regulate these tools. I know that in Europe you're already far ahead of us than we are in North America on this discussion about ownership of data and stuff, but I think that I remain optimistic about the use of these tools, and especially in the GovTech sector, and how we can find new ways to carefully consider how to use things to promote the public good while being aware that they could be abused. So I think that's going to be the next step in this process that you described, Diego.
That's great, thank you. So we know that there are thousands of startups, you know, developing tech solutions to help governments to deliver better services. But we still don't see them. We still don't see those technologies embedded in our governments. Some are more advanced than others. My question for you is why? What is missing in the ecosystem? It would be great if each of you could mention at least one thing briefly in a minute or two. So I don't know who wants to start. Tanya? Yeah.
I mean, I think there are many, many factors that go into this. I guess one I would mention is political will or political buy-in. In the UK context, a few years ago, we had the founding of GDS, the Government Digital Service, which was an in-house body designed to digitize government. And it had some fairly powerful champions, and that was very useful in, for example, giving the department spend control. So, for example, we were talking earlier about IT contract, multi-year IT contracts that were very costly and weren't necessarily serving government. GDS was given power to go in and try to rein some of that back. But it really needed that political buy-in. And if you don't have that, it's going to be very, very hard to innovate within the context of government. I think there's also a risk, though, of being overly reliant on individual champions, because, of course, champions leave government, and then what do you do? So it's also about getting broad-based support and realizing that you might be working with people who imagine government very differently to you and finding ways to communicate across those cultural barriers, for want of a better word.
Thank you. Helen?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the history of government technology has contributed a lot here. In some countries more than others, but if public officials are kind of damaged in some way by bad experience with technology in the past, it becomes a sort of it becomes the kind of worst thing you can do for your career to go for a technology project. And I think that is the case in some countries, particularly the UK. Same with contracts that have gone wrong or failed relationships. I mean, I think some of the most interesting innovations with a democratic slant are actually quite simple, like petition platforms, for example, as you have here in Madrid, in Barcelona, in Germany, in the US, and the UK and the US before the current incumbent in the White House. Not that the platform's there, but nothing much is happening with the petitions. But I mean, I think petitions are interesting because they are examples of those kind of tiny acts of participation which people are doing in literally millions. We had the biggest petition ever in the UK, both after the ghastly Brexit referendum, when several million people signed a petition to reverse the referendum result, sadly unsuccessful so far. And also another one to block Donald Trump from having a state visit to the UK, something that the Prime Minister had offered him. Now that may sound frivolous, but I think it's quite exciting that, you know, young people, teenagers were signing these petitions in their droves. In an earlier era, we would not have seen young people in the UK sort of getting involved in American politics in that way, or even sort of knowing about things like that. And I think that is quite exciting. So I think we should foster what you can get. Also, those kind of platforms generate new data about people's needs and preferences and policy preferences. And we should be making advantage of that, not, you know, petition platforms can be derided as just kind of single issue politics and so on. But often, and we've seen this over and over again, a small bit of political involvement like that can lead to something larger and a participation in the open budgeting process, as is happening in Madrid, for example. So I think they are a small step, but an important one.
I think in general governments are not comfortable working with startups. They prefer to work with larger, bigger companies, mainly because of what I mentioned, because of the risk aversion. If you work in a complex project and you hire IBM and the project doesn't go well, maybe you will not get fired, But if you hire a very small startup and the project goes badly, you made a mistake because you hired, a very small player that could not basically execute that project. So I think in general there's aversion from governments to work with startups, and startups are not basically don't have the time, the money, the energy, and the patience sometimes to go through the super complex procurement processes that governments have in place. So there's a gap, between government and innovative startup companies in the e-government space. How to bridge that gap? The way we've done it, and the way most companies do it is you go through system integrators that are large, basically companies that are used to integrating third-party technologies and selling that to governments. What's the problem of doing that? That usually they don't add a lot of value, or in many occasions they don't add a lot of value, but they add a lot of cost. So basically the taxpayer and the government ends up paying more than what they should. And the startup doesn't get basically their fair share of the project, because these are big companies that have a lot of leverage in the negotiations with the smaller startups. So it's not the ideal reach, but that's how it actually works. I mean, it's very rare for a government to buy a critical application from a small startup. They usually buy it from a very large system integrator. And usually they tend to benefit, especially in the public space, this happens a lot, they tend to benefit local champions, local companies that maybe have political connections or have basically the relationships with the government to basically sell these type of projects.
Wonderful, thank you.
Garbage. Okay. So an interesting example of GovTech use is, so we're familiar with blockchain technology, most commonly cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. But so this is built on something called distributed ledger technology. And I read an interesting case recently of how blockchain technology can be used to handle waste management at a local government level, which I think kind of emphasizes the positive points of this technology. So a local government can create an authoritative record of when waste collection subcontractors complete their rounds, and, for example, picking up garbage in a neighborhood. And at the same time, citizens and local companies could register problems like garbage that hasn't been picked up in a specific part of town. So a distributed ledger that's accessible by citizens, by subcontractors who are collecting garbage, by the town council or whatever, they'd be able to register these problems. Everyone would see transparently. The subcontractors get an automated notification when there's a problem, which allows them to fix it. And that will save the time and transaction costs of a citizen submitting some kind of complaint to the local town authorities. And if a subcontractor regularly fails to provide their service, they're contracted to do so. So within the distributed ledger, there's so-called smart contract, which will automatically penalize them for failing to provide their service. Obviously, because they know this, they have a huge incentive not to fail, right? So, and this would, the point of this, having this distributed ledger technology for waste collection means that it would cut down a huge amount of transaction costs and providing greater transparency and participation for citizens. So I think garbage collection could be the future for blockchain, guys. Forget about Bitcoin.
That's great, thank you. Now, one of the most promising uses of GovTech is online voting. And there is this hope that this technology...
I didn't prepare this question.
Okay, no, I know. So there is this hope that this technology is going to help us to increase citizens' participation, putting an end to this crisis of representativity that some democracies are suffering, especially in the West. And it's going to allow us to have that direct democracy that has been part of the dream of politicians, and especially policy theorists for centuries. Now, I have two questions. The first question, perhaps, Pere, you're the best person to answer this, is what's the current state of this technology? And us, also how do governments, for instance, in North America, feel about this? My question is exactly when are we going to see Europeans or North American countries selecting their presidents using their mobile phones, basically? And the second question for Helen and Tanya I have is, what are the consequences? What do you think could be the consequences of this? Because having more citizen participation will only have good effects for democracy in our states, or it could bring also some big troubles.
Okay, so online voting in political elections is already a reality. Actually, it's already happening in presidential elections in the US. I will explain the case. There are 23 countries in the world that have used online voting in political elections, either local, regional, or federal type of elections. A commercial here of the 23 countries, Untitled has done 21, so we have a big market share. What's the problem? The problem is that it's limited to a very small portion of the population in these 23 countries. So it's usually either the people, for example, that live overseas, that have a big problem participating in elections, or in the case of Australia, the people that live very far away from a polling station, or people with disabilities. Those are other groups. So the next phase that we're expecting and waiting eagerly, that it will happen, is from one of these 23 countries that has done it for, 500,000 voters, 1 million voters, to do it for the entire country, for everybody who wants to vote online during the week before the election, and then on election day, you can still go to the polling station if you want to vote online. So where has this happened, first of all? It has happened, for example, in the United States, it has happened in Alaska. In Alaska, you can vote online in the presidential election. Is Alaska a coincidence? No, it's not a coincidence because the elections are at the beginning of November, and in Alaska, it's very cold, so people were demanding a way to vote without having to go to the polling station. But it's happening in Alaska, it's happening in Canada, in France, in Switzerland, in Norway, in Australia, in India, in many different countries. So what is it going to take to go to the next level, which is an entire country doing online voting? Basically technology, and the technology, we think it's already there because of a concept that is the end-to-end verifiability. End-to-end verifiability has two different levels. It means that the voter has to be able to verify two things: that the vote has been cast as he intended, number one, and the second thing is that the vote was recorded as it was cast. So the voter at the end of the election can actually verify that the vote has been counted as he wanted, but she needs to be able to do this without compromising his privacy and without the possibility of she being able to sell her vote. So it's a little bit more complex than just basically verifying that the vote was there. So that's one level of verification. It's called individual verifiability. And the second level of verification is called universal verifiability, which is any third party, any political party that questions the election needs to be able to audit that all the votes that were decrypted and counted correspond to the votes that were cast and encrypted, And that basically is something that technology already allows. Cryptography, advanced cryptography allows to provide mathematical proofs for the universal verifiability, so that third parties and auditors can verify that an election conducted online was not tampered with, and tools also that provide voters with a tool that allow them to verify individually that it was. Don't ask me how we do that because it would be. So we are there, I think. Obviously, what has happened in the last few months is going to be a problem, in the short term. It's going to slow down, the adoption. But there are several countries that are almost there. Switzerland has already approved that in 2019 everybody can vote online. Switzerland is a country that has been using online voting since 2003, so it's been a 17-year process to get there, but it has already approved, and there is some security requirements that companies that want to provide this type of solutions need to meet, and a certification process. France, President Macron, in his agenda, had online voting for all the French citizens as part of the agenda. We'll see whether this is a reality or not. And Australia and Canada are also making big steps towards full online voting for the entire country. So I think this is something we're going to see in the next 2 years.
Thank you. Ozren, what's your view on this?
I was thinking, as a student of the humanities and as an avid media consumer, my sense is that this issue might become quite politicized, and that might hamper it. And yes, definitely the events of the last year have kind of accelerated that process. But I wonder if, I mean, and Pere, I'm sure you have much more insight into this, if it's not simply an issue of whether we can do this in a technological sense. So let's say we can, and we can do this securely, and we can ensure that everyone has whatever, passcodes or whatever that they need in order to access the system. I wonder if we can even get that far without this becoming a huge political debate within any country, and that kind of, unfortunately, stopping us from adopting a tool that could expand, the franchise to more people. In a practical sense. I don't know if you have any comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing you need, if you look at, for example, Switzerland, which approved online voting for 2019 for 100% of the population, I mean, you need two things. You need political consensus. So in a country, for example, that is as divided right now as the United States, it would be unthinkable, that to introduce online voting in a massive scale. It already exists in Alaska, but in a massive scale in the key swing states, to introduce online voting like in Ohio, Pennsylvania, or Florida, I think it would be very difficult. But in a country like Switzerland, where there is consensus among the political parties that this is something that they want to do, so the first element is consensus, and the second element is that it has been a gradual process. So Switzerland started with pilots back in 2003 in 3 cantons. The pilots were successful. They analyzed the feedback, the results from the different stakeholders. Based on that, they develop a law that allow up to 10% of the population in Switzerland to be able to vote online. Based on the feedback on that experience of 10% of the population, they increased the threshold to 30%. 3 years ago, the threshold went up to 50%, and now it's going to 100%. So it's been a gradual process where there's been lessons learned, where there's been basically security requirements that have been defined, and a certification process to make sure that any system complies by those requirements. And that has been the second ingredient. So I think the 2 ingredients is you need some political stability, political consensus, and the second one is it's a gradual process. It's not something that happens overnight.
Pere, if you don't mind, if I can keep you talking, I got a question. I have to take advantage of this opportunity since you're here. Can you tell us about some of the maybe revealing hiccups that have occurred in some of the cases that you've implemented where things maybe didn't go so well, if that's possible?
Well, before... during lunch, I said that
very briefly, please.
Sorry.
No, I mean we've done elections. Last year we did the presidential election in Kenya that had to be repeated. It was a presidential election. It was very disputed. There were a lot of claims of fraud, and it had to be repeated. For us, it was great because we collected twice from the government. And it was not our fault that it was repeated. But we've done elections in Libya during the civil war, in the Ukraine as well. So I think one thing that people think or perceive from the outside that have never been involved in elections is that elections are perfect processes. Yeah. And the reality is that they are super far from anything that you think is perfect. Nothing ties, nothing... if you're an accountant and you work in elections, you would feel extremely uncomfortable, because you add the number of people that have voted and then the votes counted, and they never tie in any polling station. So they are not perfect processes. There is a lot of human intervention, and when they are human, there are errors. And this is another case, for modernization. But I think we've seen as I said before, the good, the bad, and the ugly in the election world. The elections are an outcome of the governments that we have, and the governments are an outcome of the society that we have.
That's great. Thank you, Pere. Helen and then Tanya, what are your views on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally in favour of online voting, and Estonia too has used it for a very long time. I don't know if you do.
We didn't do it. That's why.
I thought that's why you didn't mention it. But I don't think we should, and I mean, I think it can be less corrupt than postal voting, for example, which tends to end up as sort of vote early, vote often. But I don't think we should expect it to sort of cure all democratic ills. I mean, and we shouldn't focus attention on that at the expense of other parts of the electoral process. I mean, turnout, for example, in the UK and many other countries, the problems are around electoral registration as much as they are actually turning out to vote. There's also questions of political information. I mean, basically, the whole kind of process of voting in some countries is completely antiquated. You know, in the UK, it is literally the only time anybody ever uses a pencil, unless they're going to draw something. And we do need to do something about that, but we need to think about political information. We need to think about the regulation of political advertising online. There's all sorts of aspects of the political process that we ought to look at, and we shouldn't let online voting sort of take the attention away from that and think that it will cure all our ills.
Thank you very much, Helen. Tanya.
I think the consequences will be very context specific, and it relates to this point about trust in institutions and trust in technology. So if you have low degrees of trust in both or either of those, then the product could actually be lots of conspiracy theorizing about why the vote went one way or another using these new technologies that maybe people don't understand so well. There are examples both from Argentina and India recently where there's been a lot of controversy over whether or not they should be introduced. And in India, actually, they tried to demonstrate that this technology was good to go by doing demonstrations in local communities. And on one occasion, the technology failed, so it only registered votes for one candidate. So that shows, obviously, at that particular moment, the technology was not up to scratch. But what was really interesting was the kind of highly politicized conspiracy theories that then spawned around that incident. So I think that testing and proving that the technology is up to scratch in low-stakes cases is a good starting point. And I think an interesting example of this was during the Colombian peace plebiscite in 2016. Not all expats could vote. And so Democracy Earth Foundation, which is a tech non-profit, developed a digital platform that allowed those people to register their votes. Now, they didn't count, they were non-binding, but it was a way of doing two things: allowing people whose voices wouldn't count anyway to have their say and be represented in some format, and also show that the technology was able to be used. So I think those are the kinds of tests that we need to see, and if we see that they're successful, that trust will begin to build.
Great, thank you. So we're running out of time, but there are at least two topics that I would like to touch with you very briefly, at least. One is misinformation. The spread of fake news and misinformation on social media and social networks is a hot topic right now, and probably the way we address that issue will determine the future of GovTech, at least in the coming years. So my question for you is, what needs to be done here to tackle this problem, and who should be doing it? Should governments take the lead? Should Facebook and Google solve the problem? Should each citizen solve this issue in their homes? What are your views on this issue?
All of those things. Any response to fake news has got to be multi-level. There's no one actor. And part of all this is about the accommodation of new actors in democratic systems. I mean, social media platforms like Facebook are mammoth new actors in our political systems, and they've only been there sort of less than 10 years, really. So we've got to work out how to accommodate them, and that is going to involve putting pressure on them to deal with the question of fake news. They have started to do that, but you know, it's been little and late, and there's a lot more to do, but they're already employing thousands and thousands of moderators and fact checkers and so on. Governments are going to have to regulate, and we've talked a little bit about that, but a lot of political institutions, democratic institutions like electoral commissions, information commissioners, for example, they're just not fit for purpose in terms of regulating political advertising. This is high-tech, data-intensive stuff which governments find it difficult to confront. And anybody who watched Mark Zuckerberg speaking to Congress last night will surely have noticed the kind of information asymmetry between people like him on the platform and the congressmen who were doing the interviewing, barely able to sort of read out the words from their pieces of paper, let alone know what they mean. So, you know, we've got some serious work to do. But another issue in this kind of multi-level approach has to be the question of education, teaching people how to read news, you know, working out innovative ways to make news more kind of accessible, the question of how trusted the sources can be. And, you know, we're only at the beginning there, because there was a time when school kids, for example, probably didn't read any news. I mean, they weren't going to kind of watch the BBC News or sit down with El País or whatever. And now they're having it thrown at them all the time on their phones. So it's much more important to kind of educate them and talk to them about what can be trusted and what can't. But also, I suppose that's a positive note for this session. Back to the positive note, that actually all sorts of people are seeing more news than they have before. We just have to make sure it's kind of better.
That's great. Thank you very much. Ozren.
I think it's a solvable problem right now. First, I think the major social media that have featured this kind of fake news, so Twitter and Facebook, are under enormous pressure to come up with some kind of solution. So, if only for the purpose of avoiding or minimizing regulation, that may affect their bottom line. So I think there is kind of like a convergence here where they're incentivized to make some adjustments ahead of someone else getting too involved in their business. I think, for example, partnering, so yesterday in his testimony, Mark Zuckerberg hinted at partnering with some independent verification, some information or news verification services that eventually could, in close to real time, verify the information that's shared on those platforms. I think something like that could be possible quite soon. I think, though, one of the points that you raised, Helen, regarding the issue of education is central, because what if, let's say, for example, we're able to identify something on social media that is, fake news? Will people care, right? Like, is identifying as such enough to make them go, oh, and dismiss it? And I think there, education, and probably at quite an early level, is essential to identify them with the perils of this of accepting and sharing and buying into information that might not have a legitimate source or be based on facts and reality. So,
great, Pere or Tanya, any views?
Yeah, I'll just say two brief things. I, of course, agree it should be a multi-stakeholder approach. The first thing I want to say is that we shouldn't be overly reliant or imagine ourselves to be able to be dependent on technological fixes to this problem in the particularly near future. So the Poynter Institute, which does a lot of work around fact-checking, is keeping track of technologies that help fact-checkers. And the results are not great for now. So I don't think this is a situation where we can imagine technology to provide a fix for this big social problem. Just on the education dimension, this is something we were discussing earlier. I think humanities are particularly key to this question. So there's a lot of talk about defunding humanities and perhaps passing resources more towards STEM subjects. I don't think that's the right approach. I think it needs to be a mix, because I think humanities subjects, in very particular ways, help people to navigate today's online environments, including social media platforms. So just to give a specific example, history of art, which is kind of, at least in the UK context, it's kind of maligned a little bit as a discipline, actually teaches you how to pass, in a very fine-grained way, visual products. And that's exactly the kind of skills that we need to be able to navigate the world that we're living in today. And of course, there are many like skills that come from, say, history or literature as well.
Thank you very much.
I think the risk is an overreaction. The risk is that we come up with a solution that is worse than the problem that we're trying to fix. I think that what is fake news, what is not fake news, there are some cases where it's factual, but in most cases, especially in politics, what can be true to me, maybe to somebody else, is false. I mean, there are many issues that where there are different opinions, and having someone saying what is true and what is not true, I find it disturbing and dangerous, especially if it's a corporation. Is Mark Zuckerberg now going to be the person that tells us what is true and what is not true? Or is a government, the one that is going to do that? So, I don't know, I think we need to
Calm down.
This is an essential point. I think like the power of making this judgment is extraordinary, and you know, even if a social media can hire thousands of people to check it, like, who are they? Who are you? How are you qualified to do this? According to what parameters? What about disputes and appeals? Like, you know, we're entering this bizarre world, which is so complex.
But we also don't want to push the platforms towards just thinking news is too difficult to deal with and taking news. Exactly. Facebook have already reduced the percentage of political news you get in your news feed. They've only taken it from 5% to 4%, but still, that's a fifth. And I think it would be a shame if what happened was that we pushed them just towards pictures of cats and things because it's non-controversial.
That was very interesting. So we only have 4 more minutes, and I would like to ask you one last question. So please give me a yes or no and a very brief explanation of your point. Cryptocurrencies, you know, such as Bitcoin, they are already disrupting our financial system. Some experts claim that they should be banned. Some other experts claim that they should be regulated, and some even go further and say that governments will use them, should get into them. My question to you is, what are your views on this? Should we ban them? Should we use them, and why? Helen.
Well, I'm not a big fan. I think they introduce instability into financial systems which are unstable enough. So I'm not sure about banning them. I mean, that would just make them more popular on certain constituencies because people will be more likely to think that they are kind of a good thing to have. But I don't think we should be leaping into Bitcoin markets. No.
Great. Thank you. Pere.
Honestly, I don't know enough about cryptocurrencies, but I don't think they should be banned. I think they should be regulated, as any securities are regulated. So if you do an ICO, you know, an initial coin offering, you should be subject to the same type of regulation as if you do an IPO, because at the end, fundamentally, it's the same. You know, you're selling securities.
Tanya.
I don't think they should be banned, but I am highly concerned about the energy costs of Bitcoin transactions, and I don't think there's enough discussion of that. So one Bitcoin transaction uses the same amount of energy as powers an American home for a week. And I don't think there's enough discussion of that dimension of Bitcoin usage at all. So I think that needs to be brought into the public debate.
Great point, yeah.
Tanya, that's a great point. I rarely hear people say that. I just want to take this opportunity to kind of encourage people to think about applications of blockchain technology beyond cryptocurrencies. So we see kind of this cryptocurrency, the transaction of value. It's quite, I don't want to say obvious, but it's an evident application of it. But there are other ways that we can use this technology to track, for example, property ownership, and even to interact with the state, for example. I mean, we might not be so far away from people paying taxes this way, keeping track of what's owed and kind of revenue, this kind of thing.
Great. Well, I think that was a fascinating discussion. Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.
And